The Black Kiss, Chapter 3. 3 dreadful hours. With a shock, he was himself once more, completely. The cold water had done it. The water in which he found himself swimming. He was in the ocean, borne on waves as silver as the lightning that occasionally flashed overhead. He heard thunder, felt the sting of rain. Without wondering about the sudden transition, he swam on as though fully aware of some planned destination. For the first time in over a month, he felt fully alive, actually himself. There was a surge of wild elation in him that defied the facts. He no longer seemed to care about his recent illness, the weird warnings of his uncle and Dr. Yamada, and the unnatural darkness that had previously shadowed his mind. In fact, he no longer had to think. It was as though he were being directed in all his movements. He was swimming parallel with the beach now, and with curious detachment he observed that the storm had subsided. A pale fog-like glow hovered over the lashing waters, and it seemed to beckon. The air was chill, as was the water, and the waves high. Yet Dean experienced neither cold nor fatigue, and when he saw the things that waited for him on the rocky beach just ahead, he lost all perception of himself in a crescendo of mounting joy. This was inexplicable, for they were the creatures of his last and wildest nightmares. Even now he did not see them plainly as they sported in the surf, but there were dim suggestions of past horror in their tenebrous outlines. The things were like seals, great fish-like bloated monsters with pulpy, shapeless heads. These heads rested on columnar necks that undulated with serpentine ease, and he observed without any sensation other than curious familiarity that the heads and bodies of the creatures were a sea-bleached white. Soon he was swimming in among them, swimming with peculiar and disturbing ease. Inwardly he marveled with a touch of his former feeling, that he was not now horrified by the sea beasts in the least. Instead, it was almost with a feeling of kinship that he listened to their strange low gruntings and cackles, listened and understood. He knew what they were saying, and he was not amazed. He was not frightened by what he heard, though the words would have sent abysmal horror through his soul in the previous dreams. He knew where they were going and what they meant to do when the entire group swam out into the water once more, yet he did not fear. Instead, he felt a strange hunger at the thought of what was to come, a hunger that impelled him to take the lead as the things, with undulant swiftness, glided through the inky waters to the north. They swam with incredible speed, yet it was hours before a seacoast loomed up through the murk, lit by a blinding flare of light from offshore. Twilight deepened to true darkness over the water, but the offshore light burned brightly. It seemed to come from a huge wreck in the waves just off the coast, a great hulk floating on the waters like a crumpled beast. There were boats gathered around it, and floating flares of light that revealed the scene. As though by instinct, Dean, with the pack behind him, headed for the spot. Swiftly and silently they sped, their slimy heads blurred in the shadows to which they clung as they circled the boats and swam in toward the great crumpled shape. Now it was looming above him, and he could see arms flailing desperately as man after man sank below the surface. The colossal bulk from which they leaped was a wreck of twisted girders, in which he could trace the warped outline of a vaguely familiar shape. And now, with curious disinterest, he swam lazily about, avoiding the lights, bobbing over the water as he watched the actions of his companions. They were hunting their prey. Leering muzzles gaped for the drowning men, and lean talons raked bodies from the darkness. Whenever a man was glimpsed in shadows not yet invaded by rescue boats, one of the sea things craftily snared his victim. In a little while they turned and slowly swam away. But now many of the creatures clutched a grisly trophy at their squamous breasts. The pale white limbs of drowning men trailed in the water, as they were dragged off into the darkness by their captors. To the accompaniment of low carrion laughter, the beasts swam away, back down the coast. Dean swam with the rest. His mind was again a blur of confusion. He knew what that thing in the water was, and yet he could not name it. He had watched those hateful horrors snare doomed men and drag them off to the deep. Yet he had not intervened. What was wrong? Even now, as he swam with frightening agility, he felt a call he could not fully understand. A call that his body was answering. The hybrid things were gradually dispersing. With eerie splashings, they disappeared below the surface of the gelid black waters, pulling with them the dreadfully limp bodies of the men, pulling them down to the blackness biting beneath. They were hungry. Dean knew it without thinking. He swam on, along the coast, impelled by his curious urge. That was it. He was hungry. And now he was going for food. Hours of steady swimming southward. Then the familiar beach, and above it a lighted house which Dean recognized. His own house on the cliff. There were figures descending the slope now. 2 men with torches were coming down to the beach. He must not let them see him. Why, he did not know, but they must not. He crawled along the beach, keeping close to the water's edge. Even so, he seemed to move very swiftly. The men with the torches were some distance behind him now. Ahead loomed another familiar outline, a cave. He had clambered over these rocks before, it seemed. He knew the pits of shadow that speckled the cliff rock, and knew the narrow passage of stone through which he now squeezed his prostrate body. Was that someone shouting far away? Darkness and a lapping pool. He crawled forward, felt chill waters creep over his body. Muffled by distance came an insistent shouting from outside the cave. "Graham! Graham Dean!" Then the smell of dank sea foulness was in his nostrils. A familiar, pleasant smell. He knew where he was now. It was the cave where, in his dream, he had kissed the sea thing. It was the cave in which... He remembered now. The black blur lifted from his brain, and he remembered all. His mind bridged the gap, and he once again recalled coming here earlier this very evening, before he had found himself in the water. Morella Godolpho had called him here. Here, her dark whispers had guided him at twilight, when he had come from the bed at Dr. Yamada's house. It was the siren song of the sea creature that had lured him in dreams. He remembered how she had coiled about his feet when he entered, flung her sea-bleached body up until its inhuman head had loomed close to his own. And then the hot, pulpy lips had pressed against his. The loathsome, slimy lips had kissed him again. Wet, dank, horribly avid kiss. His senses had drowned in its evil, for he knew that this second kiss meant doom. "The sea dweller will take your body," Dr. Yamada had said, and the second kiss meant doom. All this had happened hours ago. Dean shifted around in the rocky chamber to avoid wetting himself in the pool. As he did so, he glanced down at his body for the first time that night. Glanced down with an undulating neck at the shape he had worn for 3 hours in the sea. He saw the fish-like scales, the scabrous whiteness of the slimy skin, saw the veined gills. He stared into the waters of the pool then, so that the reflection of his face was visible in the dim moonlight that filtered through fissures in the rocks. He saw all. His head rested on the long reptilian neck. It was an anthropoid head with flat contours that were monstrously inhuman. The eyes were white and protuberant. They bulged with the glassy stare of a drowning thing. There was no nose, and the center of the face was covered with a tangle of wormy blue feelers. The mouth was worst of all. Dean saw pale white lips and a dead face. human lips. Lips that had kissed his own. And now, they were his own. He was in the body of the evil sea thing. The evil sea thing that had once harbored the soul of Morella Godolpho. At that moment, Dean would gladly have welcomed death, for the stark, blasphemous horror of his discovery was too much to bear. He knew about his dreams now, and the legends. He had learned the truth, and paid a hideous price. He recalled vividly how he had recovered consciousness in the water, and swum out to meet those others. He recalled the great black hulk from which drowning men had been taken in boats, the shattered wreck on the water. What was it Yamada had told him? When there is a wreck, they go there, like vultures to a feast. And now at last he remembered what had eluded him that night, what that familiar shape on the waters had been. It was a crashed Zeppelin. He had gone swimming into the wreckage with those things, and they had taken men. 3 hours. God. Dean wanted very much to die. He was in the sea body of Morella Godolpho, and it was too evil for further life. Morella Godolpho. Where was she? And his own body, the shape of Graham Dean. A rustling in the shadowy cavern behind him proclaimed the answer. Graham Dean saw himself in the moonlight, saw his body, line for line, hunching furtively past the pool in an attempt to creep away unobserved. Dean's flippered fins moved swiftly. His own body turned. It was ghastly for Dean to see himself reflected where no mirror existed. Ghastlier still to see that, in his face, there no longer were his eyes. The sly, mocking stare of the sea creature peered out at him from behind their fleshy mask, and they were ancient, evil. The pseudo-human snarled at him and tried to dodge off into the darkness. Dean followed, on all fours. He knew what he must do. That sea thing, Morella. She had taken his body during that last black kiss, just as he had been forced into hers. But she had not yet recovered enough to go out into the world. That was why he had found her still in the cave. Now, however, she would leave, and his Uncle Michael would never know. The world would never know either what horror stalked its surface, until it was too late. Dean, his own tragic form hateful to him now, knew what he must do. Purposefully, he maneuvered the mocking body of himself into a rocky corner. There was a look of fright in those gelid eyes. A sound caused Dean to turn, pivoting his reptilian neck. Through glazed fish eyes, he saw the faces of Michael Lee and Dr. Yamada. Torches in hand, they were entering the cave. Dean knew what they would do, and he no longer cared. He closed in on the human body that housed the soul of the sea beast. Closed in with the beast's own flailing flippers. Seized it in its own arms and menaced it with its own teeth near the creature's white human neck. From behind him, he heard shouts and cries at his back, but Dean did not care. He had a duty to perform. An atonement. Through the corner of his eye, he saw the barrel of a revolver as it glinted in Yamada's hand. Then came 2 bursts of stabbing flame, and the oblivion Dean craved. But he died happy, for he had atoned for the black kiss. Even as he sank into death, Graham Dean had bitten with animal fangs into his own throat, and his heart was filled with peace as, dying, he saw himself die. His soul mingled in the 3rd black kiss of death. End of Section 4, and end of Weird Tales double feature, The Salem Horror and the Black Kiss, by Henry Kuttner and Robert Bloch. Read by Ben Tucker.